We'll go ahead and get started. It's great to see everybody. I'm Dreama Gentry, Berea College Partners for Education, and thanks for joining us in this conversation for action, part of our Rural College Access and Success series. It's great to be with you guys. When we scheduled this, we didn't think about it being the day after the election, and I'm thinking about doing this today and working today, and a lot of folks didn't get a lot of sleep last night, and we're all still waiting, and we're in this unusual new place that we've never been before. So I want to thank you for joining today and joining in this conversation. When I was thinking about it this morning, and honestly, I was dreading it a bit because in a way I'd like to stay in my pajamas and keep watching the news. I realized that this is the work that needs to keep happening, and that our work with rural places, rural schools, the relationships that we're forming throughout rural America to think about rural places and rural students. It's the urgency of the work, and it's really what keeps me focused and keeps me going. So I'm happy to be here. I want to invite Geoff and Sky Marietta to join me. Geoff and Sky are here in Kentucky. They're authors, they're entrepreneurs, they're educators. And I think first and foremost, they're folks who are committed to rural places. Geoff, Sky, any thoughts on just doing this today in this time?
Well, hello, everybody. We're glad to be part of this today. We're coming at you from southeastern Kentucky, from definitely coal mining area. And you're right, the election really brings out some of the differences that, urban, rural people think about divides. Pre-Trump election, when we worked on rural work, it seemed very neutral, and it brings up a lot of interest, a lot of intensity, sometimes a lot of negativity. But I think it definitely points out that a lot of rural communities don't feel served, are feeling like they need more support, that they aren't getting what they need. So I think it is a very interesting, important, and I would even say exciting time to be focused on rural America.
Yeah, it's, and it wouldn't be 2020 if the tornado siren isn't going off in the background while we're doing this.
No tornado.
Yeah, just they test it at this time every day. But we're so happy to be invited for this talk. And yeah, I mean, the day after the election, what a better time to be talking about these important issues that I think, for decades have been going on, but really didn't get discovered until, we had the election of President Trump. And then obviously it's been in the forefront of people's minds over the last 4 years, and it still is today. And I woke up this morning, like you, Dreama, kind of wondering what was going on. And Sky and I just looked at each other and we said, let's get back to work. Let's do it. Let's keep doing what we've been doing, and because it's got to get done for things to improve and change.
Yeah, I think that's it. And I think that's one thing I'm finding as I'm meeting people from rural places around the country. It's that sort of mentality of let's just get to work and do this because we have to do this for the communities. But tell us a little bit about yourselves. I love that you're a married couple that's doing this work together, and you figured out a way to blend family and work and community. So tell us a little bit about yourselves.
Sure. So I was born and raised up in northern Minnesota, up on the Iron Range in a mining town, Hibbing. It has the largest open pit iron ore mine in the world. It was right outside the town, like literally off of Main Street. I went to school in Montana and then moved to New Mexico to be a special ed teacher on the Navajo Nation, and that's where our paths crossed. And we fell in love, and Sky told me about this place in Eastern Kentucky that was amazing, called Pine Mountain Settlement School, where her mom taught. And we packed up a U-Haul on our way up to Cambridge, Massachusetts, and stopped and got married there. And that's how I got introduced to Kentucky and Sky, and I'll let her tell her story now.
So I'm from Berea originally, and I'm from a family that goes back many generations in Eastern Kentucky. I'm number 5 of 7 children. So, grew up, and I went from Berea, I went to Yale, which was not, and probably is still not very common at Berea, and had that extreme culture shock experience. And while I was there, realized, all this research we have on poverty. And I was like, oh my goodness, this is about me and my family. I qualified for free lunch every year. And this is associated with all these bad outcomes, and really wanted to focus on rural communities and moved to the Navajo Nation, where I met Geoff. He didn't mention we met at a rodeo. So it was clearly, meant to be. And while we were there, we were like, we don't really know how to serve our students and our communities well. And so we decided to apply to graduate school. And we thankfully both got into Harvard, and, we've been working together ever since.
Yeah, so we spent 11 years there. I got my MBA and PhD. Sky got her PhD and did a postdoc. And we wrote a lot of cases together, a lot of research together on education. We did some rural work there. We forced it to happen because there was nothing going on, and we made it a priority for us to seek out opportunities to study. So we wrote some cases on northern Minnesota at the time, and Sky did her dissertation on Eastern literacy, early childhood literacy in Eastern Kentucky, and comparative. And so we found ways to make it happen. And then, we were there, and we had this big choice to make. I had started a software company that was doing very well, and we were both looking at academic jobs, and came really close to taking, professorships in different universities. And Sky's mom got very sick with bone cancer, and we kind of looked at our lives, and we had two young kids, one of whom we named Harlan after Harlan County, and the other one's named Perry after Perry County in Eastern Kentucky. And we just said, this isn't what we accumulated all these degrees and all this education and experience and success for. Let's go, back home, and, be with her mom. And so we both thought about applying for the Pine Mountain Settlement School Executive Director, which is a beautiful nonprofit in Harlan County, kind of a community center environmental education program with a gorgeous campus where we were married, where Sky's mom taught. I was appointed the director there, and that was 5 years ago. And we've just been investing and working and writing about Eastern Kentucky. And today I'm an entrepreneur in residence at the University of the Cumberlands, and Sky's an assistant professor here as well. And we own businesses, we teach, we write, we raise our children here. Our kids go to school down the street. So we're all in.
Well, and just for this particular audience, I'll say we're at the University of the Cumberlands, which has about 50% first-generation college students. A lot of those students are coming from Appalachian counties in Kentucky. And my role there is I'm the director of what we call the Learning Commons. So I'm specifically helping undergraduates, especially freshmen who are academically at risk, to get resources and tutoring and study groups and things like that. So, and Geoff does a lot of various work with, what I think we often call opportunity youth. And so this is, this age that a lot of you are engaged in is very important to us.
And I think that folks will find it interesting that while at Harvard, you actually were, is it called dorm parents, or?
Yes, we were. So there's a fancy word for it there called a proctor, but we lived in a freshman dorm for 10 years. We were there for about, I think, say we had over 200 students, and Harvard has a very intensive support system for its freshmen. So they have these layers of support, and we were academic advisors. We were really there behind the scenes. We read people's admissions files before they even came and shepherded them. And because they were very strategic, most of the first generation college students at Harvard, especially most of the rural first generation college students, were placed with us. So we got to see that transition. And now, some of them are married with children because you do it for long enough. So you've gotten to see some of their trajectories over time.
Yeah, and that's something I'm sure people will want to dig into, but I'm really excited about your book. And the book is really what I wanted us to focus on here. So do you have a copy of it? I haven't seen a copy yet.
We do.
Yay. Isn't it exciting when those things actually are published? That's powerful. So tell us about the book and how you came to write the book. And if you want to share some slides with us about the book, do that.
Yeah, do you want to just do a little intro?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a good chance that what drew us to write this book is what a lot of you all are struggling with. You know, so often when we think about interventions or how do we support people, we have this idea that, you know, often we're focused on first generation or children living in poverty. And really, there's this fundamental question of, do we really think it's the same thing to grow up poor in a very urban area as it is to grow up poor in, you know, in New Mexico or in Montana or in Eastern Kentucky? So what we kept on finding is we'd get these solutions that were just sort of placed on the community or the approach, whether or not they really fit or whether or not they really made sense for our particular context. So we just wanted to bring a more nuanced perspective, a better understanding of rural communities and what their needs might be.
And so, you know, we had this reputation at Harvard as being the people who knew and lived in rural experiences. And so we had written several books before this, and Harvard Ed Press reached out and said, hey, do you know anybody who could write a book in rural education? And I said to them, well, you know, here are some of the scholars in the field. And they said, well, they came back a couple of weeks later and they said, no, actually, we want you all to write it. And Sky and I talked about it, and, you know, because taking on a book is obviously a tremendous amount of time and effort, but we felt it was important to get this message out there. And as we dug into it, I mean, some of the statistics you'll see are just will blow your mind. So let's just give you a quick overview of some of the things going on. And I'm going to click the next slide here. So, you know, here's one thing that we constantly see is this, you know, gap in educational attainment in rural areas. And we go into it specifically and complexify this idea, but the gap is real. You know, there is a tremendous 13-point gap in between, and this is metro and non-metro, but of people attaining a bachelor's degree or higher. And this is metro and non-metro. In high poverty rural areas, that gap is almost double. So here in Eastern Kentucky, out on the Navajo Nation, out in South Dakota, Native nations there, in the Rio Grande Valley, you know, you can just expect that this gap's going to be huge. And what that means is there's been this seismic shift in the economy over the last 40 years into services sector, and jobs in manufacturing, resource extraction, fishing, timber harvesting have almost been cut in half. And with that, all of the highest paying jobs, you need a bachelor's degree. And that, you know, things are changing a little bit with micro-credentialing and trades and things, but generally, you know, the better paying jobs, services sector jobs require a bachelor's degree. So rural America has been basically shut out of this shift in the economy, and it's caused all sorts of ripple effects politically, economically, socially. And so, you know, this is a big, big, big challenge that rural America, in addition to others, and we'll get into it, faces. And so we want to just hit it off right there with that and start to complexify what it means to be rural. And this is the thing is, you know, the Census Bureau, which is charged with actually coming up with a definition of what it means to be a rural community. And then that definition is then changed and used by all these different agencies, including the U.S. Department of Education, all of their research agencies, the USDA, even you know, Veterans Affairs, because all of their funding mechanisms really have to flow through some type of definition. Well, this is the thing, when the US Census Bureau made their definition in the early 1900s, it was urban first. So they actually defined urban areas first, and this is still the case. It's an urban centric definition, and then anything left over is classified as rural. And so you end up with these very bizarre places. And we picked these three places because there's three places we've lived. And so San Juan County, New Mexico, 63% is Native nations. There's 21 people per square mile. Yet this is defined as a metro, a metropolitan area in some cases. In some definitions by the U.S. Census Bureau. Actually, it's an urbanized cluster is how they define it. St. Louis County, where I grew up, Hibbing, 900,000 acres of wildlands, population density of 32 people. Again, urbanized cluster. Harlan County, Kentucky, and I think we saw someone checking in from Harlan, and we own a business there. And the city of Harlan's 1,400 people, the county's 27,000. Again, classified as an urban cluster. And so these are the definitions that researchers are using, that they're rolling up into their data sets to decide the efficacy of interventions, to decide how money is allocated. And it's very problematic. And guess what? And we all know this as people who do work in rural areas, it doesn't work. It does not work for rural areas. So that's the one piece that people have to keep in mind is, the data that we're using right now is just not accurate, doesn't reflect the realities of rural America.
And I'm just gonna jump in to add one thing that who is really undercounted, who we really don't measure and understand, are minority populations living in rural communities. We don't know very much about, many of our Native students, our students of color. And one thing that we just want to push on over and over again is rural is diverse in America. There's this myth or misunderstanding that all rural Americans are white. That's not the case. We're doing a terrible job of measuring and understanding some of our populations. And then you start to think of dualities like, okay, so what if you are Navajo and you have a disability? What if you are Navajo and English is not your first language? So you start to add in the complexities, and really there's students out there who we pretty much from a analytical or number perspective know almost nothing about. They aren't reflected at all.
And then of course the digital divide. 5 million rural students don't have access to basic internet. That's a huge number. And it's even worse for rural African American and Hispanic students. In some remote areas, 41% of African American students, that's almost half, have no internet access. And obviously with COVID and saying just go virtual is, you're essentially violating the civil rights of these students by not offering them a free and appropriate public education. And this is a huge problem. It should be a national emergency right now. And we hope it changes. They've been working on it for years here in Eastern Kentucky with very, very little to show for it, except for in a few areas, not in Harlan County, I can tell you that. But, we hope that this is another issue that gets raised, and that something can be done about it.
One thing that we really want to push on too is the strengths of rural communities. I think it's easy, and especially, right now we're in these polarized times. And so it becomes easy to think about what are the deficits or the problems. And when we looked at research on rural communities, so many of them are framed around problems or framed around, people leaving. You get these book titles like Hollowing Out and Other America. And really, when you look at the research, even with the limited empirical information we have, we can see that rural areas have strengths. I mean, we have good research that shows that there's actually greater socioeconomic and racial integration in rural communities. It's harder to separate yourself off into subdivided communities. Everyone goes to school together, because how would you even make it to that private school? Now, obviously not true everywhere. We're not saying segregation isn't an issue, but by and large, it's not necessarily what people think. You've got strong, deep, and stable family ties and social networks. That matters a lot. It matters a lot for the resilience of children. For those of you thinking about higher ed, will people persist? Will they make it through? Relationships matter. And then you've got these teachers. Teaching is a very good job in most rural communities. So what you find over and over again is that there's very highly qualified teachers. A lot of them are deeply embedded in the community. It's a lot harder to have somebody sort of parachute in and work in a community that they're not part of when they're in a rural area. So they also a lot of times have this deep cultural knowledge and can connect with students. And then of course, we've got a greater connection to the natural world and foodways. And that's something that, we're probably going to see greater importance of over time.
And we would share all the references. These are all backed by, research. These aren't just our opinions. These actually have very strong, deep research Ross Chetty backs a lot of this. He's an esteemed economist out of Harvard, and has drilled down on the data down to zip code. And so we share a lot of that, basically collect a lot of that research that's in disparate areas and bring that together to back up these strengths. And we wanted to end here, this, and we have one more slide, but, this idea of the brain drain, and this is something we just, hammer on in the book. And we want to complexify that because, it's a term that gets thrown around a lot without people really thinking about what are the primary causes, and how does this actually look. And so here's a few things that you have to consider. One is, the vast majority of students actually attend a college or university within 50 miles of where they grew up. And yet rural areas are these higher education deserts. They cover 97%, but only home to 14%. And, here's another thing. People want to live near their family. Pew did this great research study in 2018, and 57% of people have never lived outside their home state if you exclude them going off to college or military. And the reason why is because they want to live near their family, because that family and friends gives more meaning to their life than money, career, or anything else. And so this is the thing, is like, you can say there's a brain drain, but really we are forcing rural students out, not because they want to leave. They're just as qualified to go to college according to their, test scores and everything else. And they also want to go to college just as much as their urban and suburban peers. So all the pieces are there, but they don't have access to college. And then again, this seismic shift in the economy, they don't have access to economic opportunity. And so I think rather than talking about people leaving because, they don't like their hometown or they want to get out or whatever, that's just totally untrue. They want to stay, their communities want them to stay, their teachers want them to stay, their parents likely want them to stay, but they, in some cases, just can't. And then the other piece is, we tell urban and suburban students often, hey, go out to college, go to New York or learn, but, ultimately bring those experiences back. And so we talk about the boomerang effect. That is very real. Rural students do come back after gaining some experiences, and we're a test case to that. Yeah, it took us, 20 years to get back, but we're back, and that happens. So rather than talking about this, fleeing of the brains, it's also disrespectful to the people who are still in the community as if they're not smart or something. But we really complexify this idea of the brain drain. And then I guess finally, and then I'll stop talking for a little bit, we've outlined these forces, and we've touched on a lot of them here that are really shaping these rural communities. And we talk about what happens when a meat packing plant shutters and closes, and all the first generation immigrants, Mayan community is all of a sudden arrested and deported, how that affects a rural community. And so in the community leadership, what if you have really strong community leaders? What if you have a declining population? What if you have a big oil shale boom in North Dakota, and all of a sudden, a huge population influx, economic vitality is going way up? What happens then? So it's, we don't, we use cases from all over the United States, places we've lived, places we haven't, from many different states and communities to highlight and bring to life these forces. And with that, I'll stop sharing, and we can open it up, I guess, or whatever.
Yeah, thank you for those slides and for walking us through that. It's really powerful. And I'm still seeing, there we go. Now I see you. Okay. So just a few questions and I'm thinking, of these folks that are like me, that are working in communities to really get more young people into and through college. And you talked about those strengths of rural communities. And I love that slide, because we often take that deficit approach. And I think that really summarizes that asset-based approach. But how can practitioners tap into those strengths in their community when they're working to create what we call that college going culture in their school and their community? Thoughts on that?
Well, one of the things that we bring up in the book is really taking a place-based understanding. So we have a process that we outline that a lot of it is actually understanding the history of your community, and not obviously just for one population of people in the community, but for different people, and who is employed and how did that happen, and where are you at at a particular moment in this socio-cultural context, and really trying to think about what are options and opportunities, and how do we frame things for students so it's not just about go to college, get this degree, but find a way that it makes sense within their community, that it makes sense within the relationships and ties that they already have. And I think when you're working with rural students, because we're constantly still working with these students, you see that how if you can find a purpose for it and build the relationships, especially with the family, and make it something that everyone's invested in, you're just far more likely to slug through those hard times when you have to pass college algebra or whatever it is that's making it hard and making you just want to potentially return home.
Yeah, and I mean, the other thing is you just access to different opportunities and thinking about how can you provide high quality experiences, internships, things like that would help build that culture. And there's just a big deficit of those kinds of opportunities in rural areas. And so, a lot of what we talk about is how do you go to a very isolated rural community and get that student or that group of students connected to a summer program or an after school program. There aren't any. And that's a big problem, because kids in urban and suburban areas have access to those. Part of it is population density, but another part is actually, we need policies and funding that actually reflects rural needs.
There's this really great research in the field of literacy about trying on a disciplinary identity, right? So if I can try out being a scientist as a 14-year-old girl, I'm more likely to persist and believe that I can be a scientist. So part of it is making those connections and helping students see these possibilities for themselves and creating those opportunities.
And we show some examples like FFA and 4-H are two of the most powerful programs that are doing this. We have some great quotes from students who grew up in rural areas that found FFA and 4-H and really, getting world-class STEM experiences, preparing them for college. And I just, one other thing, I think, for us, it's college and career success, or college or career success. Like I think this is, very well known. We 4-year degrees aren't for everybody, but trades, certifications, apprenticeships, obviously, are growing tremendously. And we talk a lot about that in the chapter on college and career readiness, about some very innovative programs that get students into something that's going to lead them to a successful career in life.
Yeah, and I think that's the thing that we often forget when we work and we say we're doing college access and success. We're all working toward career, right? That hopefully every college graduate will end up in a career. And I think sometimes we lose track of that, right? We think success is actually them getting a 4-year degree, but actually, I know for us, success is really attaining a degree that opens up the door to economic mobility, happiness, fulfillment, being able to live where you want to live. Yeah, so I think that thanks for reminding us of that piece. And Sky, I appreciate what you were saying about the family, and that we can't just work with the student. We have to also think about engaging the whole family in that piece. I think that's another area there's not been a lot of research on, is how do you deeply engage families of rural students in sort of this journey piece.
Especially for first gen students, we talk a lot about that. Like, I think, and I don't want to complicate this, golden cage idea of the family preventing the student from going to college. Certainly that exists. We're not denying that exists. But at the same time, if your parents didn't go to college, how are they? We worked with students at Harvard, who didn't know how to live in a dorm, didn't know you had to have a shower caddy, and there's all those little cultural pieces that are scary. And, really has a lot of cultural learning. I mean, I know for both Sky and I, the academic component, we had to learn the academic and the cultural at the same time. And that for rural students, especially first gen rural students, that's a lot to handle.
And I think, it's interesting, some of our work in Appalachia, and we work in some of the same places that you live, we survey the parents of students when those students are sixth or seventh graders. And we find that close to 90% of the parents have this vision at that point that their child will receive a college degree, and that they're supportive of that. And we see that as the student ages, that number goes down. But we also see that same parent that thinks their child will go to college as a middle schooler, no, they don't understand financial aid. They don't know how to get the information. They don't know how to do the planning. And I think that's really what we're seeing is the disconnect. There's this myth. In a way, it's easier to have this myth that rural parents don't want their kids to go than it is to realize the reality is we're not meeting the needs of those parents. Is there other myths that you think people hold about rural places that you came up, or the stereotypes you want to bust?
Let me hit everyone with some research here. You are more likely you have greater socioeconomic mobility the more isolated and rural community you live in as compared to urban and suburban peers. So the further you live from a metropolitan area, the more likely you are to move up in socioeconomic class throughout your life. And so in this research, this is Roz Chetty's research, and I've dropped that on people, and they try to, they probably then move to cities and that's how they make more money, but who knows what the underlying, it'd be interesting to look at, do a case study to actually figure out the black box about why that's happening, but it's happening. And we have our own theories because our sons, obviously it's very integrated in terms of socioeconomic. Our kids go to school with doctors' kids, go to school with parents who are both unemployed and disabled. So there's a lot of socioeconomic integration. And so you think, what would the effect of that be on a kid who maybe, whose parents don't have college going, who are first gen? What is the effect of having kids in their class who are the sons and daughters of doctors or professionals or lawyers? What does that affect? I mean, there's a lot of different things that I think you don't get. And actually, our publisher, got kind of mad because we said that, imagine a doctor from Boston sending his kid to a school that had 85% free and reduced price lunch. That's where our kids go. Our kids get free Tom's shoes sent home with them, free Bombas socks. We get free food sent, and but they give it away. And that really angered, I don't know about angry, but they wanted us to kind of soften that out of the book.
For a lot of people, I think you have to be in a city in order to have greater opportunity. And I think the takeaway from this is that this is the work you all do. You see somebody who's talented, you want them to have greater opportunity. In rural communities, you have an opportunity for people to come together, for it to not be as defined by where you fall in social class, to work with people to help them access opportunity as they move forward. And I see somebody saying they've personally not seen that. And I would say we could give you a lot of examples of Harvard students who have come from very remote areas. And I think the important thing is that we have to be willing to see that as a possibility, that you could be somebody who's from a very remote rural area, and you could help that person achieve far beyond what their family has. Now, we're not going to say it's easy, right? We're not going to say that a family who's very challenged And, we've got an opioid epidemic going on. You start multiplying the challenges facing a family or a child. Of course, we're not going to say that it's easy, but again, in a rural community, you still have that be a possibility. And I think the important thing is that we embrace that it's possible and try to work towards those possibilities and not be the ones who are seeing students already slotted. I think another myth that came up was around childcare. And I bring this up because obviously a lot of students are parents, right? So college students have their own children. It's a huge issue right now during the pandemic when a lot of childcare centers are closed and schools are closed. There's a myth out there that, poor rural women don't need childcare. Well, what's one of the highest percentage population of working parents is actually African-American women in the Deep South. And they have some of the least access to childcare. So we've got to understand that a lot of times the service isn't there, not because there isn't a demand for it, but because we simply don't have that for people. So, take something like childcare that can be make or break about whether somebody makes it through college if they're a parent. And we can't just assume that people don't need it, that it's not wanted. And I think this is what we see so often in rural schools and rural K-12 and in rural college. Education has to help find and provide and promote all kinds of resources. It's a much more holistic approach because we can't just rely on this place and that place filling in the gaps.
And I'd love to have to dig into that conversation more in the future, just about that economic mobility and rural. And I think that because that's just really intriguing. But thinking about here, I've heard policy come up a couple times. And I know, Geoff, you mentioned the national emergency around the digital divide. And then Sky, I totally align with you around childcare. It's a national emergency and it should be framed that way also. What can folks do that are working in rural places and rural communities to influence or impact that? Because speaking for myself, I feel helpless at times when I think about that digital divide, and I'm not, and it would help me to know what are some specific things that I can do to really start this big, to impact something so big.
I wonder the same thing. I think that there's some things that you see. So first, let's all come to a common understanding of what the problem is. And I think we've seen with the digital divide, just doing some simple surveying of what is your based internet speed. There's this great story we have in the book about this teacher in Hazard, Kentucky, who was teaching his students computer science, and he took a Raspberry Pi, which is a very simple, inexpensive computer, and they all basically designed a internet speed test program. And all the students took the Raspberry Pis home. There's 35, 40 students, and tested the internet at their home using the device. And he came back and collated that information. And then he was a Teach for America teacher. It ended up getting written up in one of their articles. And surprise, surprise, the internet speed was terrible. It was like less than 1 meg, per home, and an average of like 0.75, which you can't do anything with. And so stuff like that, I think, just, highlighting some of the issues. And there's just some incredible teachers out there. If you just give them just a few resources and support, and then really, this is just one thing, is earned media, earned publicity, anything that's getting the story out there. Sky's got an amazing blog that gets thousands of hits from people. And then what ends up happening is NPR calls, which can be good or bad, or the New York Times, which can be good or bad, because the narrative, the media, we could talk about politics, but the media is a big part of the problem too. And we've tried to complexify as much as we can, but so often the stories, the narrative is already there, and they're just looking for support for that narrative. So I don't know if Sky has any solutions. The thing is like on the digital divide, there's already an E-rate tax that that gets charged on everyone's phone bill to incentivize companies to go and install in rural areas. And there are companies like People's Rural Telephone Cooperative out of Jackson County and Lee County that are doing it. But the AT&Ts and the Verizons and the Frontiers and these other companies that aren't in the communities, they are not responsive. And so there's solutions out there. They're there, everything's there, but you know, I don't know. I don't want to pick on politicians, but
well, here's something. Here's a small practical tool, right? Because I know it's in education. We like the make and take, the thing we can use now, and I would say that is universal values. So I'm going to explain that. I did this great fellowship with Jack Shonkoff on the Center for the Developing Child, and they talk a lot about resilience and how do we build it and try to do policy change around it. Well, they do research on how do you change hearts and minds. And one of the big things they found is you get everyone together on a universal value. Like we all want the best for our community. We all want our students to be able to go out and create new kinds of opportunities. And I think when the conversation, especially when it turns negative, it's a really easy way to redirect. Like these are things we all want. And I think particularly, you know, when you're doing the work, there's going to be hard conversations around race, around social class, around who's having opportunity and who's not. So that moment to redirect towards a North Star isn't going to solve the problems. But the more you can bring people together towards a common goal, the more likely you are to keep the conversation moving in a positive direction. I mean, it's so easy to get discouraged. You know, I get discouraged. It's 2020, we're all get discouraged, right? But just that keeping that big picture in mind, and I think that's why we're all here. We want opportunity for our students, and we want for the communities to be places of opportunity that they can come back to.
All right, I feel a little bit better that you all get discouraged too, because and
yes.
Sometimes I'm thinking, am I the only one that's getting discouraged by all of these overwhelming things? But I also am inspired by your all's work because you're still doing so much in place to make things better. And I think that's the piece that folks who do this college access work, they're doing all of those things in place to make things better.
Yeah.
And I know that right now we're all thinking about our rural students that are getting ready to go to college. And the house college is even more scary now for first gen students. So when you think about us supporting students and preparing for that transition to college, whether it's a Harvard or it's the college with the community college or the college is one town over, what can we be doing to support students that are getting ready for that scary journey?
Be positive, which I know you all know. You know, Geoff talked a lot about what a lot of people call the hidden curriculum. You know, that the best way a lot of times to take away the anxieties is to take a step back and understand what was hard. And I'd say the biggest part of this is we have experts, and you know who those experts are? They're the people in your community who went to college recently, right? So what we push on is you need to take a place-based approach. What are the big recommendations may or may not fit well for your particular community? Maybe you're in a community where English is not their native language, but they've spoken it for a few generations, and then that brings up issues. Well, the experts are often in your backyard. So maybe tap into those people, try to create networks, try to create intergenerational networks. If the strength of your community is strong intergenerational ties, let's get the near peers, let's get the older people going. Let's talk and understand that so often the people we serve are the experts, we're not, right? So let's figure out what were the challenges, what is scary, what is on people's mind. You know, in many ways, it's similar to what you do when you teach kindergarten, right? When you teach very little children, you try to understand and make this all very clear and make it plain. Well, we've got these experts here, we can understand and we can walk our students through it.
Yeah, and I think academically, I think the social piece, and then academically, we give some examples in the book of like dual credit courses, programs like PTAC, you know, access to things like Khan Academy, also, you know, ACT and SAT training courses. You know, I mean, these are things that rural students just don't have access to. So how can we get every kid who wants to go to college a free, you know, ACT, really high quality practice, you know, course? And we've seen, that in itself and like for me, growing up, people said you can't study for the SAT and ACT. And I believed that my whole life until I went to Harvard Business School and people told me, oh yeah, you take a course, you study, yeah, and because it was growing up, people just said, yeah, you're just as smart as you are, and those tests measure your smartness, and which we know is totally false.
Yeah, I was right there with you. I was like, oh, you can't. And then now I'm like, okay, we could have, and it's that hidden agenda, right? It's that there's this hidden piece that if you know that. But I think you're right. I mean, Sky, thinking about the experts being the people in place to help you build that confidence and help students, but then also pulling back the curtain and demystifying and teaching all those tricks to students and their parents. Those are key pieces. We do have a couple of questions that have come up. And if anyone else has other questions, type them in the question bar or the chat bar. One question is there any information that you all have found around research related to real or perceived discrimination against rural students or rural individuals? And then they put in quotes, that rural student in the big city, or that rural students are treated differently on campus. Jeff's smiling, so I think he wants to answer.
Well, Sky's got this great story. I'm telling the story about your accent, and then we can.
Oh, when I was a freshman. I mean, and we all have these stories, right? But when I was a freshman, I was in this English course at Yale, and one of the people in the class said, I just can't help it. Every time I hear a country accent, I just assume the person's stupid. It's just stupid when I hear a Southern accent. And I was so upset at the moment and just so caught up with anger. I said, dude, what? I was just one of these embarrassing moments. I would say that our best, to go back to like, what is the research on it? Our best research on it is probably really ethnographic research. There's this just amazing book, and it's not about young children, but it's not about college, but it's about children in this whole growing up time period. And it's by Shirley Bryce Heath, and it's Ways with Words. And it talks a lot about how different racial and social class communities, how people get trained to feel superior or inferior. And it's a very deep book, but that's really an important one to read. And there's another book by Cynthia Duncan, which talks about why do some rural communities advance economically in ways others don't. And one of the big takeaways from that book is it's where we allow social mobility to come into play. The communities that don't do well are ones where children are slated by what family they're from, instead of us seeing possibilities. So I don't think there's really good, say, empirical, numerical research about perceived discrimination, not that I'm aware of, but there's beautiful case studies and stories that also help us reflect on our own role in it.
And we've talked a lot in 2020 about institutional racism, and I think there's systems and structures that are currently in place that discriminate against rural students and in colleges. And one thing we do touch upon is recruitment. Harvard doesn't send a person to Harlan County or even southeastern Kentucky. And the relationships that counselors have with those college recruiters is huge. And so that absolutely is a discriminatory practice, but the universities would argue, well, we can't. In fact, we talk about a case study. You send someone out to rural Utah to recruit for Ivy League university. They go to 20 different schools, drive 2 days, and maybe get one application. That's what their argument would be. Now, we would say, yes, if you want America to be less polarized and more diverse, and you're looking at building a cohort, you need to invest those resources, those 2 days driving across rural Utah or rural Eastern Kentucky or rural South Dakota. If you want a diverse cohort that learns from each other. But that's some of the practices that are discriminatory, that basically don't allow rural students, access the same access.
And somebody had asked about the book titles. We'll get those from you. And when we send out the link, we'll include those book titles. And I think that, and I love that identification of that barrier, Geoff. And one of our first conversations we had was with Andrew Moe at Swarthmore, who's actually started a rural special interest group of admissions counselors from across the country that want to identify that and really figure out how to address that barrier. So it's good to know there's people out there trying to fix it.
Yeah.
And especially during this time of COVID, the virtual piece, it'll be interesting to see if we get an uptick of rural applicants, because now all the recruiting is done virtually this year. So it's going to be really interesting to see how that impacts it. When we think about your vision for the young people in your rural community, so if you think about that, what would you like to see different for young people in Harlan 10 years from now, or wherever your rural community is? This is a dream question. You guys will be great at this one because you guys are the visionaries.
Well, I think all of us on here, there's so many things that we want. But, one of the things we end the book on is this idea that we don't have a country where your opportunity is defined by what kind of landscape is outside of your window. We have this amazing opportunities that are increasingly coming online. We're denying access to that to so many of our students. So obviously, broadband access for everybody is, a big dream, but it's something that we all need to be pushing on. COVID has definitely brought this into sharp relief, but before this, we already knew that it was interfering with students' abilities to prepare for college and to be academically ready and to even complete their homework. It was a problem for a lot of people. It's a problem for doing the FAFSA and all these other places and having access to that. And the other piece behind it is we want rural students to feel like they aren't just going to college, but that they have a chance to transform their communities, right? So if they're in the kind of rural community that's been in economic decline, they can be the change makers, right? They can be the ones who look around and decide, well, what are going to be the new industries and what are ways that people can live a good life here? It'll be interesting because one of the things that's come up with COVID, all the people we know who live in big cities, now commutes are different. People are doing so much virtually. They don't know if they want to pay all that big money to live in a little apartment. So we might see over time that more and more people consider a rural life, that they understand that you might have amenities that, if you aren't having to go into a city to work in a big office building, this might be a time of expanded opportunities. And let's bring that to our rural students as well and make sure that they're part of that.
Yeah, I think that, Geoff, anything you want to add to that?
Well, yeah, I think for us, we want an economy in rural America that offers career-worthy jobs. And, that's what, that's the space that I'm in a lot, is in entrepreneurship and economic development. And we need to have jobs where it doesn't have to be you don't have to be a lawyer or a doctor, obviously that's great if you want to do that, perfect. But there also needs to be opportunities where people can, be a part owner in a coffee shop or a barista and they love it, or a chef or a cook or a carpenter, or things like that are career worthy, that they feel proud and they get paid a living wage, and a wage in which they can support, their family or, whatever. So I think that's the vision that I see is all rural America's in Eastern Kentucky there's no better place to live, in my opinion. It's so terrific. It's amazing. The recreation, the people, the community, everything. And really there's just a few pieces that we need to keep growing. And a lot of that is around the economic opportunity.
Yeah, that's great. And I would join you guys in both those visions. We did have a comment from David around the dynamics in rural seem very similar to cluster communities within metro areas. And David, that's something we're thinking about for a future conversation. So about what can urban places learn from rural and rural learn for urban. So we'll be connecting on that later. And if you have thoughts on good speakers on that, just let me know. We're at the end of our time. Thank you all so much for joining us. Sam has a couple slides that have our future conversations. And Sky, I love how, as somebody who is really specialized in that early part of that cradle to career pipeline, you take that lessons from early childcare and you apply it to the college piece. One of the things that we've realized at Partners for Education is it really is the same strategies, whether you're working on kindergarten readiness or college success around community. And so we're actually rolling out some work this next month. And Sam, it's the other slide, where we're starting to engage rural libraries across the country. And yeah, so we're doing a summit, a rural library summit on December 10th. There's no cost for this, but we would ask the folks that are doing college access to share it with your libraries, your public libraries, your college libraries, your high school, elementary school libraries. It's a way to bring librarians together to think about how they can contribute in rural communities, and we can link these efforts together. And then we'll be rolling out a fellowship for librarians, and we want 22 librarians from around the nation to join together. So that's some opportunities coming up, and we'll share these slides. And Sam, if you'll go back to the other slide. For our December conversation, we actually are going to join Texas Instruments. They're rolling out TI Talks, which is talking about STEM and partnering. So we're going to join them on December 3rd, and that will be our December conversation in action. We're banding together to do one event in December. And then the summit is December 10th. And then our College Access and Success Summit will be virtual, and it'll be April 26th through April 30th. And that registration opens in January. So those are some things that are coming up. And we'll share all this information with you all. So we'll leave that slide up. Again, Geoff, Sky, thanks for joining us today. And Geoff, did you put in the chat how folks can get the book? Because we want to make sure.
Yeah, I just threw a link in there to a website, and there's a few different places you can read a little bit more about the book, and then also links to where you can buy it.
Great, great. And we'll be in touch. This would be a great session for our Rural Summit. And Brad can't see the links. Brad, we'll get those links out when we send this. So we'll actually do a slide and do that. All right, guys, everybody enjoy their day after the election in 2020. And we'll see you guys in December. Sam will leave this up in case people want to copy down the chat notes or the dates. Thanks, Geoff. Thanks,
yeah,
Sky.
thank you for inviting us. We really appreciate it. It was fun. Thank you.